So welcome to the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity webinar series. This is our final webinar of the series. So thank you for joining us for this webinar series. It's now had 8 webinars in total. Now a little bit about the webinar series. It has been coordinated by the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network. And this network has been coordinated by Plant Health Australia with support from expert collaborators, many who we've heard from throughout the webinar series. The project is funded by the Australian Government's Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper, which is the government's plan for stronger farms and a stronger economy. Now, before we get right into the webinar, I've just got a few housekeeping things to go through. So today, all of our attendees will be on mute. However, what we do is we encourage you to pop any questions that you do have throughout the webinar into the chat box function. And what we'll try to do is at the end of Angus's presentation, we will take those questions on and I'll relay those questions on to Angus and hopefully get some of those questions answered throughout the webinar. If we don't get time to answer all the questions that come through, we will take those questions on board and provide a written response to all attendees at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network site. So today's talks, we have the first talk, which is on myrtle rust by Dr. Angus Carnegie from New South Wales DPI. And then after Angus's talk, I'll just take another 5 minutes of your time just to go through some other activities that the network's conducting. So we'll be looking at the Botanic Gardens surveillance blitzes. So I'd like to now hand straight over to Angus to talk us through a little bit about myrtle rust in Australia. Thanks, Angus.
Thanks, Daniela. Everyone can see that okay? So look, a tiny little bit of background about me and why I'm talking about myrtle rust. I was involved in the myrtle rust emergency response back in 2010. And since it's been established in the native environment, I've been doing monitoring of the impact in the native environment, working with a broad range of land managers, and also working with forestry and some of the other industries that are being impacted by myrtle rust. So what I like to do is just start off with a brief intro into biosecurity and why we should be doing surveys for myrtle rust, why we're going to be doing a blitz for myrtle rust. So this is just a bit of a schematic looking at the pest pressures, pathways and control activities for exotic pests coming into Australia. So we know there's a broad range of pests outside of the country that could damage our native flora and ecosystems. Many of these are these little green dots that are innocuous pests, but some of these are these red dots that we know are going to be significant pests if they get into the country. We have a range of pathways that they can get into the country, timber and forest products on people, on plant material, and then we have a range of controls that we use to reduce the chance that they get into the country. Some of these are pre-border, where we've got offshore compliance and import restrictions. We have a bunch of controls at the border, such as goods and passenger inspections. And then the last line of defence is post-border processes where we have surveillance around the ports as well as response procedures. However, there's still a few things that get through the net. Some of these most of these are probably innocuous pests that don't do too much damage, but a few of them cause significant environmental and economic impact, and they're the ones that we really want to stop coming through. We know from some work that we've recently published that there's been over 260 exotic pests of trees and forests that have come into the country since the late 1880s. You can see here that it's a pretty steady increase. Just regardless of the increased trade, we're just getting this steady increase, and this is just continuing to increase. So there is a real risk of of pests continuing to come into the country. We know there's a substantial economic and environmental cost of pests that come into the country. So this includes the cost of trying to eradicate a pest, but also the cost on production, and then the environmental impact that is really hard to put a dollar figure on. And some recent work looking at a significant pest in Europe, ash dieback. They estimated it was costing the British economy $15 billion. So they're the types of pests that we want to stop coming into the country. And we do that by those quarantine processes that I mentioned before, but also by training up people like yourselves to detect these things early enough that we can actually try and eradicate them if they do get through the net. We know there's still a lot of pests coming to the country. This is border interceptions of forest pests, so where they've done inspections of containers or goods or people at the border and they've detected exotic pests. They're still coming into the country. And this is quite relevant for today's audience. This is some work we did looking at the detections of exotic pests over the last 20 or so years. A lot of them were detected on amenity trees, the black dots, the black bars here. Most of those amenity trees are in metropolitan areas, many of the areas where people will be going out doing surveys. Also importantly, that a lot of these new detections were picked up by the public. And so one of the things we want to try and do today is by raising awareness and getting people out looking, we can increase that chance of detecting things that come to the country early. So not just looking for myrtle rust, it's looking for anything that anything unusual, and the classic saying, spotted anything unusual. If you have, report it. So I'll move on to myrtle rust. That's why we're here today. This pathogen, this rust, Ostroppuccinia psidii, used to be called Puccinia psidii, has gone by a range of different common names. When it was first described on guava in Brazil, it got called guava rust over 100 years ago. In the 1980s, it started to cause damage to Eucalypt plantations in Brazil, and it was enough of an issue that they started to call it eucalyptus rust. In 2005, it got to Hawaii and threatened the native Myrtaceae polymorpha there, which was commonly called ohia. So they called it ohia rust. And in 2010, when it got to Australia, we called it myrtle rust, and that's the name that's stuck and is now used more broadly globally. The important thing to know is that there are different strains of myrtle rust. So the one that we have in Australia is called the pandemic strain, and that's moved around. It's also in New Zealand, Hawaii, New Caledonia, Jamaica and Chile. There's another one called the Eucalypt or Syzygium jambos strain. That's in Brazil and other areas of South America. And that's the one that's caused significant damage to eucalyptus plantations. And so the concern is that if another strain like that got into the country, then that would cause more damage to our eucalypt flora. And then there's a couple of other strains that we also want to keep out of the country. This is just a history of the invasion events of myrtle rust from when it was described in Brazil. It sort of started to move through other areas in South America, into Central America. This is when it moved on to into eucalypt plantations as they expanded the eucalypt plantation estate in Brazil. And you can see a steep rise here in the last 10 or so years as that pandemic strain has moved broadly around the globe. And one of our concerns is that we don't want one of these other strains coming into the country. So we already know what, in a lot of cases, what the pandemic strain does to our native flora, but some of these other strains may do something more nasty or expand their host range. And there's evidence for this in Jamaica. In 1900s, they already had myrtle rust. And then a new strain came in the 1930s and virtually wiped out allspice plantations in that country. And so this is one of our concerns, is if we get a new strain that comes into the country, will it suddenly be more virulent on, for example, Eucalypts, where the current strain isn't. Similarly, in Brazil, the home of myrtle rust in the late 1980s, as they expanded the plantation estate, there was lots more Eucalypts floating around for them to get infected, and so they suddenly the disease jumped from the native guava onto the exotic Eucalypts, and it's really taken a liking to Eucalypts, and so the thing that we don't want is the Eucalypt strain coming back to Australia. Similarly in Hawaii, it got to Hawaii in 2005, spread very quickly around the islands, and it's really a major concern for the native Myrtaceae polymorpha, but also some of the endangered species that were really clinging to survival. They'd actually been fenced off from pigs and other ungulates, and they're now getting smashed by myrtle rust. So we're seeing some severe ecological impacts in some of these areas. Myrtle rust now in Australia. I probably don't need to tell this audience that we have one of the largest number of Myrtaceae in the world. Probably, I think it's a bit over half of the known Myrtaceae. Eucalypt is a major forested area, and our Myrtaceae are used for pollen, nectar, food source, habitat, ecosystems, as well as cultural significance. There's a range of industries that are reliant on Myrtaceae, and myrtle rust has been long recognised as a threat because of the issues that they saw in Brazil in eucalypt plantations. And so we were sort of prepared for myrtle rust to come here, but perhaps not as prepared as we could have when it did. So myrtle rust is here now, and this is now the distribution in the natural environments. It's along the east coast of Australia, and in natural areas up around Darwin, and then in Victoria and Tasmania, it's really restricted to the gardens, to get to garden areas. Prior to myrtle rust coming to Australia, there was about 130 species that were known to be susceptible. A lot of these were actually determined through some collaborative work with Brazil and Australian researchers who actually took seed over to Brazil of Australian Myrtaceae to see how susceptible it was. And once we got myrtle rust into the country, with all these naive hosts that hadn't experienced access to myrtle rust before, the host range literally blew up overnight. And so within a couple of years, we doubled the host range. We know there are now over 350 species susceptible to myrtle rust in Australia, and the global number of taxa is over 520 species in virtually every tribe of Myrtaceae. So there are some species that appear to be resistant, but it's a big call because we haven't done a lot of susceptibility testing, and you could probably say that almost every Myrtaceae will have some sort of susceptibility to myrtle rust. So what's it done in the native environment? Over the last several years, we've been, or sort of going back to the 2012, 13, 14, we monitored some key Myrtaceae that we knew were susceptible and relatively widespread. And so we did surveys of Rhodomyrtus, brush turpentine, which is sort of a common understory rainforest species along the east coast of Australia. And in 2014, 12% of trees surveyed were dead. So this was 2 years after myrtle rust had got into the native environment. We did some more surveys in 2017, and in some stands up to 50% of trees were dead. This species now been listed as critically endangered because of myrtle rust, and we haven't seen any fruit or mature fruit or seedlings since 2011. So all the seedlings as they come up are being killed, and and there's no recruitment going on. So this species has been significantly impacted. Similarly, Rhodomyrtus psidioides native guava, the surveys we did in 2014 showed that about 50% of the trees were dead. In some populations, 100%. Again, this species listed as critically endangered. Some more work we did recently with Rod Frenchman and his group really showed that there's steady decline, or pretty steep decline of this species. And here you can see some examples. This is a mature stand, sort of 12+ metre trees, all killed within a couple of years of myrtle rust coming into the country. We're also seeing community level impacts, and so what I showed you before were individual species. This is some work from Jeff Pegg up in Queensland, where he looked at a broad range of species in a valley in southeast Queensland, and what we were seeing there is what appears to be a steady replacement of these highly susceptible Myrtaceae that are either extinct or no longer ecologically functional, and they've been replaced by non-Myrtaceous species that aren't susceptible to myrtle rust. So we're actually really seeing within a relatively short space of time these community level ecological impacts. The plant industries have been less impacted than the environment. The nursery and garden industry, when myrtle rust first came into the country, they had an increased fungicide application, and many of them had to move away from certain species because they were too susceptible to propagate. Lemon myrtle, Myrtaceae citriodora, has been impacted, partly because of the oils. They need to spray fungicide and you have residues. They're also looking at going organic, and that's thrown that out the window. Forestry wasn't really impacted at all, nor was tea tree. And there are some cut flowers that are such as camelorsium that are highly susceptible, but where these production areas are, it's too dry for myrtle rust to impact. Now I'm hoping everyone here is aware of the Myrtle Rust Action Plan on the Plant Biosecurity Science Foundation website. This really looks at a national plan for an environmental response to myrtle rust. So we know that the biggest impact at the moment for myrtle rust is in the environment, and there's just not a lot of work being done in the environment. And so the idea of this plan is to try and raise awareness and get some work, a coordinated approach to myrtle rust in the native environment. So why would we survey for myrtle rust? So one of the reasons we'd be surveying for myrtle rust, we know that myrtle rust is up and down the east coast. We know there's a lot of species that are susceptible to myrtle rust, but there's really been, there's a paucity of actual surveillance going on for myrtle rust. And so the more observations we have on host susceptibility, what hosts are being hit by myrtle rust in different areas, it really increases our understanding of the impact on a range of hosts across the country. The other thing that potentially we would do is detect change in the pathogen. So if suddenly we see new hosts have been impacted by myrtle rust, or a change in host susceptibility, some species that used to be hardly impacted by myrtle rust are now getting significantly impacted, it might give us an indication that the pathogen is changing, or that we might have one of these new strains in the country that we might need to either manage or do something about. So that's why we would be asking you all out to do some surveys. And so what are you going to be looking for when you go out looking for myrtle rust? Myrtle rust, I get in trouble when I say this, but myrtle rust is quite a pretty disease. You get these really nice bright yellow pustules on leaves. Sometimes you get this red discoloration around the leaves. Sometimes there's a yellow discoloration around the leaves. But with myrtle rust, it only infects new flush. So it doesn't, mature foliage is resistant. And so we're really looking for mature foliage with these yellow pustules on these powdery yellow pustules on the foliage. And there's a lot of variation in these symptoms across all the different hosts. The thing with Myrtaceae, it's not always big, bright yellow pustules that you see. Sometimes it's these individual little spots, look like brown spots on the leaves. Sometimes it's just yellow discoloration on the leaf, and sometimes it's purple discoloration on the leaf. And so ideally, having a hand lens to look further into the individual pustules is helpful. But sometimes it's difficult to determine that it is actually Myrtaceae because of these variation in symptoms. We see fruits and flowers infected as well as shoots and leaves. And sometimes you see, this is Syzygium jambos, which is really highly susceptible. And you very rarely see this much damage, but sometimes you'll see, this is Rhodomyrtus, some fruit infected as well. And often what we find with that fruit is it then aborts prematurely. And so that's the type of issues that we're having with this fruit being infected. One of the problems for trying to do surveys for Myrtaceae is that after a while, those nice bright yellow pustules become brown and necrotic. And then in severe cases, the leaves shrivel up and die, and you get shoot dieback. And so here are some examples of where Myrtaceae has then caused the shoots to die. And it's really hard to ascertain that that is actually Myrtaceae. Here's an example of a single spot on a leaf. And if you look closely, you can actually see old grey pustules and eurygenespores there. But it's still really hard to determine that that was exactly Myrtaceae. The other thing that we have with Myrtaceae, and especially with Eucalypts, is there's all sorts of other spots and things that get on them. And so if you walk out into the forest in any Eucalypt stand, you'll find all these sorts of things getting on your Eucalypts and all sorts of other Myrtaceae. So here's some example of a range of different leaf spot fungi that can be found on Eucalypts, and this is actually insect damage. And so one of the things with Myrtaceae is to confirm that it's Myrtaceae, we really need to be seeing those nice bright yellow pustules, because once those lesions become necrotic and you lose that yellow colour of the pustules, it's really difficult to differentiate damage from any of these all these other types of pests and diseases that are out. Most of these are natives. And so just sort of wrapping up, what are we looking for? Myrtaceae, obviously. And it's often better to look at a range, multiple plants per species. So we do, in a patch of say 10 or 20 species of Myrtaceae, a single species. In some cases, all of them will have some Myrtaceae. In some cases, only one of them will have Myrtaceae. So it's often a good idea to look at multiple individuals. We're looking for the new growth flush, because this is where we're going to find that new infection, those yellow pustules, to really give us a confidence that we're looking at Myrtaceae. There really is nothing else that looks like Myrtaceae on Myrtaceae. And if possible, we're looking in protected areas that might have high humidity and leaf wetness. What we find this time of year, that overnight dew on the leaves is enough to cause infection. And so even in those areas in the middle of winter, we can still find infection in lower lying areas, in gullies, in understory plants and things like that. And so, and I think this is where I hand it back to Daniela. We want you to then record that in MyPestGuide. And it's important that we're after both presence and absence records. So, if we get a lot of absence records for a particular species, we start to get some confidence that if that's in an area that myrtle rust is present, that's a species that's either resistant or very low susceptibility. And if you're taking photos, it's always good to get a wide view so that you're looking at the whole branch, and then a close-up of the individual leaves. And yeah, feel free to report both yellow pustules where you've got some confidence that it's myrtle rust, or if you've got necrotic spots. Some of us can work out just from the photos what those other pests and diseases are. And I'll hand it back to Daniela. I think I've got to stop sharing.
That's it, that's perfect. Thanks, Angus. What a great presentation. And I think that really feeds into the blitzes that we'll be doing. We have had a few questions come through in the chat box. So what I'll do now is we'll take a few of those questions. Unfortunately, we won't have a lot of time today to go through maybe all of them, but I'll take a few of those questions now, and then we can move on to the surveillance blitzes. So we have a question here, Angus, on could the intense fires of 1920 have slowed down or controlled myrtle rust spread up and down along the east coast?
Yeah, look, great questions. One of the concerns we had before myrtle rust came to the country was what would happen to regeneration after bushfire, because you've got all this nice new flush. And so what we've been doing, working with Jeff Pegg and some of the other agencies, is doing surveys in bush regeneration areas. And we're actually seeing a significant impact of myrtle rust on a broad range of hosts because of the fires, because there's so much new flush. So even though the fires might have taken out a lot of the myrtle rust, there's enough of it sitting around to build up. And what we're seeing is some hosts that we wouldn't normally see a lot of impact of myrtle rust, such as Eucalyptus pileolaris, blackbutt, a lot of the regeneration and coppice being severely damaged by myrtle rust. So unfortunately, in a lot of cases, the fires have made myrtle rust worse.
Another one along the lines of its spread. So are we expecting it to be more common in a La Nina year as this year appears to be?
Look, what we see with myrtle rust is, so theoretically it needs nighttime temperatures, warm wet temperatures in nighttime, because that's when the spores germinate. And that's what's in the literature. But what we're finding is that in the middle of winter up the north coast, we're still getting lots of myrtle rust going through. Really high rainfall tends to wash a lot of the spores off. So you actually, in really high rainfall periods, you actually get less disease. But even in really dry areas, you'll get less disease. But often if you've got some sort of flush event, realistically, you can still have some myrtle rust infection.
We have a question on how long the postulates will be present on the plants for.
Yeah, look, it's so basically so for a month to maybe 6 weeks, you'll still see some of the yellow pustules, and it's really variable across the times of the year and the species, but you should see them for up to 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. And then they start to go a grey colour, and then it gets really hard to really discern. But what you often will see is multiple infection events on an individual plant, so that the first flush got infected. As those leaves matured, the pustules matured, and so those mature leaves will then have old rust on them. And so when I mentioned that mature leaves are not susceptible, doesn't mean that they won't have rust on them. They just had them when they were younger. And so sometimes you'll see bright yellow pustules on the new leaves and old brown pustules on the older leaves.
Great. We have just time for one more question. So one of the questions was, about myrtle rust distribution, and has any been found in the Blue Mountains area?
Yes, it has. I'd have to have a look at our map, but basically it's been found from Bateman's Bay, is around Bateman's Bay is the most southern point that we've found it. We've confirmed it for in the native environment, right up to the Cape, and about 100 k's inland. We've found it in places like the ACT, but mainly in Botanic Gardens and things like that. It's definitely at the foot of the Blue Mountains, because I've got a colleague who has it in his garden in Penrith, but yes, it will be in the Blue Mountains.
Great. Unfortunately, we'll leave it there today for questions, and I'll just quickly go through the surveillance blitz with everyone, and it feeds perfectly into some questions that we've actually been having through the chat function as well around reporting. So I'll just share my screen. The Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network is actually going to be conducting or coordinating 3 surveillance blitzes, and these are to occur between September and November this year. So a little bit about a surveillance blitz. We will be targeting or calling on visitors, friends, volunteers and staff of Botanic Gardens to take part in these 3 targeted biosecurity pest blitzes. These blitzes are a way to conduct surveillance on plants, pests and diseases, and they're run over a set period of time, and it encourages community to participate in surveillance for pests and diseases. So what we're going to encourage all of you to do is to take part in Myrtle Rust Blitz, which will run from the 12th to 20th of September, so in a few weeks' time. What we'll be encouraging you to do is to look for myrtle rust on up to 5 different plants belonging to the Myrtaceae family. So Angus's talk today was fantastic because it gave us a few tips and tricks on what to look for, how to look. And it's also given us a bit of idea on why it's important to look for myrtle rust. We will be reporting those, encouraging those reports to be made through MyPestGuide Reporter. So if you go into the App Store and download MyPestGuide Reporter app, that will be the reporting app that we'll be using as part of the Blitz. So once again, look on up to 5 different plants belonging to the Myrtaceae family. And what we want you to do is we want you to make a report on whether you found the plant present or whether it was absent. And if you do have any details on the plant species that you've looked at, please provide that information in your report as well. And we'll be encouraging you to send that report through to the Botanic Gardens project on MyPestGuide Reporter. So please keep an eye out on our website and Facebook page for further details about these Blitz activities. We will be providing articles on our website and providing some promotional material through Facebook. So please keep an eye on those sites. Another surveillance activity that we'll be conducting is a stink bug blitz, and this will be in October. And what we'll want you to do then is to look out in your local botanic gardens if possible, or your backyard gardens, or wherever you can get to in these COVID times, and to look out for brown marmorated stink bug. And then once again, make those reports through MyPestGuide Reporter. And finally, we want you to actually go out and look for a plant. So we want you to go out and have a look for Tree of Heaven. Now, Tree of Heaven is an introduced species to Australia, and it's shown to be a significant host of spotted lanternfly and brown marmorated stink bug. So we want you to go out, report where you find Tree of Heaven, and use MyPestGuide Reporter. So we really hope that you can get engaged in these surveillance activities and help us. So once again, keep updated on the blitzes through our Facebook page and our website. So I'd just like to thank now Angus for his presentation today and taking the time to speak to everyone. If everyone could quickly fill out a quick poll before you jump offline. But thanks again for joining into the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network webinar series. It's been a fantastic series. I've really enjoyed every 2 weeks running this webinar. And I hope you've all enjoyed it, and I hope you all get out there and look for myrtle rust in your own backyards.